Thanks for being here.
Absolutely.
Well, hi, everybody. Welcome to First Friday. Go ahead and get started here. I think there's probably still some folks trickling in. But my name is Carol Easterly. I'm one of the museum program coordinators here at the Kentucky Historical Society. We're very glad to have you with us today. If you've been signed in for a little while, you probably just learned a whole lot about Scott Albee and about Dr. Fletcher. I did. It was great. So we're glad to have you with us today. Before we get started, just a few reminders. Do please remember to keep your microphone on mute during the program today. But please use the chat feature to submit any questions or comments that you wanted to make. We'll save the questions for the end, and then I'll communicate them to Dr. Fletcher. You are welcome to keep your camera on if you would like to, so we can see you smiling back at us. That's always nice. We want you to be aware of a few upcoming events here at KHS. Next Thursday night, we're going to host another Kentucky History virtual trivia night starting at 7:30. And our theme is going to be Kentucky Women Behaving Badly because it's Women's History Month. If you're more into bingo, we do have a family virtual game night coming up on March 30th as well. And the theme for that one is going to be Sounds of Kentucky. It's hard to believe, but spring break is actually upon us very soon. If you're looking for something for your kids to be doing during that time, consider signing them up for one of our spring break virtual camps. You can find more information on all of that, all of those programs at our website, history.ky.gov. Finally, it's tax season. Yay, I know that's everybody's favorite time of year, but if you haven't already filed your state taxes, please consider donating a portion of your state income tax refund to the Local History Trust Fund. You can help support the work of local history organizations all around Kentucky. It's very easy. When you're filling out that state return, just look for line 38F, check that box, and then you fill in the dollar amount that you would like to contribute. And then all of that money goes into a grant pool, which KHS administers, and we're able to, we give grants to organizations all around the state that are doing some great work. So that's the way to make your mark for history during tax season. All right. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Charlene Fletcher. She brings a breadth of experience to her work as a historian, which is really cool. She has worked in domestic violence and sexual assault prevention, as well as leading re-entry classes for incarcerated individuals to help them transition back into society, and recently completed her PhD at IU, just a little up north. And she specialized in 19th century United States and African-American history and gender studies. And currently she is the ACLS Emerging Voices Postdoctoral Research Associate in Slavery and Justice at Brown University. But we know as I learned just a few minutes ago, she's got very strong Kentucky roots, which is pretty awesome. We are very proud to call Dr. Fletcher a friend of KHS. She was a research fellow here not all that long ago, 2015. And she contributed to our blog and wrote book reviews for the Register, which is great. And I'm sure Stephanie is going to be hitting you up for articles if she hasn't already. But it's really exciting for us to see how she's been able to use collections that live here at KHS to shed light on the past, and in particular, the experiences of women who their stories have largely gone untold before now. So welcome. Take it away, Dr. Fletcher.
Thank you. I am going to share my screen. And please let me know, can you see this? Are we good to go? Mm-hmm. Yes? Perfect. Okay, so I thank you again. I am so excited to be with you all today. As I say, anything for KHS, best folks ever. And the slides that you're going to see today all of the images that you'll see are directly from KHS collections. So yes, so digital collections, some things you'd have to go into the Kentucky History Center to see, but what you see before you comes directly from KHS, with the exception of, I believe, one image, and that comes from the Capital City Museum right across the street, where my good friend Russ Hatter and John Downs run the ship over there. So I truly miss Kentucky. But I'm excited to be here just to share. This is a small little piece of my forthcoming book. This was my dissertation turned into a monograph, and the book will be called Confined Femininity, Race, Gender, and Incarceration in Kentucky, 1865 to 1920. And fingers crossed, it will hopefully be out, if not in 2023, then in 2024 with the University of North Carolina Press. So my work illuminates the lives of confined Black women by examining places like jails, prisons, mental health institutions, and a site not typically considered confining, the home, and other related domestic spaces. And that's what we're going to jump into today. My work explores how Black women both defied and defined confinement through their interactions with public, social, and political entities of the period, as well as how they challenged Victorian ideas of race and femininity in Kentucky. Specifically, I move beyond a historical analysis of penal institutions to argue that Black women negotiated the parameters of their own confinement. So when we talk about things like freedom, you know, everyone has a different definition of freedom. And sometimes freedom, or what we collectively may think of as freedom, may not necessarily be the goal. Sometimes these women simply wanted a respite in the midst of very confining situations. And sometimes that led them to state-sanctioned confinement, as we'll see today. So we'll jump right in it. Each May, horse racing fans gather in Louisville for the Derby. The festivities are dotted with mint juleps, fancy hats, and rousing renditions of Stephen Foster's 1852 ballad, My Old Kentucky Home. For many Derby-goers, Foster, who was a Pennsylvania native, conjured visions of a nurturing, peaceful environment, a place to call home. However, for some Kentuckians, home was anything but nurturing. In the 19th century, many American women fought individual battles against domestic violence and domestic labor for safety and freedom in their own homes, while women reformers of the day worked diligently to advance suffrage and temperance agendas, as well as labor, educational, and social welfare reforms. Today, I will give you a glimpse into two old Kentucky homes, that of Fannie Keys Harvey and Lyla White, two 19th century African-American Kentuckians who navigated the pains of abuse and confinement in their own homes. And unfortunately, that confinement led them to the Kentucky Penitentiary, the old Frankfort Penitentiary. So, in 1891, Lyla White was a 16-year-old African-American domestic worker. She was arrested for poisoning her relatives with arsenic. The story came as a shock to Lexingtonians who knew Lila's family as both respectable and church-going. Lila was the daughter of Peter White, a local coachman, and she was not your typical Black teenager. She worked as a live-out domestic in the home of the Fayette County Comptroller, Frank Bissix. And she worked long hours to avoid life in her own home, and even learned to read and write while working for the Bissix family. Newspaper accounts document Lila's reports of emotional and physical abuse at the hands of both her father and stepmother. And it was a severe beating she received from both parents for attending the church of her choice that led to the fateful poisoning. I always like to say, you know, my father is a Baptist preacher, and he would be just excited that I'm going to church. So to have Lila as a young 16-year-old just simply want to attend the church of her choice is always kind of jarring for folks when I tell this story. Pushed to the breaking point, Lila took her revenge on her parents by emptying a vial of arsenic into the family's coffee grounds. 4 people ingested this tainted brew, but only 2 died. Lila's aunt and uncle, who were actually related to her stepmother. Lila was held in the Fayette County Jail for trial before receiving a 15-year sentence in the Kentucky State Penitentiary for manslaughter in 1892. And going forward, I'll either refer to the prison as the Frankfort Prison, or KSP, just to keep things brief. Circuit Court and KSP records indicated that Lila was incarcerated with another Black woman, 10 years her senior, Fannie Harvey. Fannie was known in Lexington as a hustler and a notorious negress, but she appears to be a woman who resisted abuse in every facet of her life. Before I go to the next slide, I just want to point out the image that you see here is an ad for Rough-Horn Rats, and this is held by the Digital Commonwealth and the Boston Public Library. Lila was reported to actually go to the local druggist in Lexington to ask for a small vial of Rough-Horn Rats. And the druggist told her, that's, you know, too small of an amount. So I'm just going to give you a small vial of pure arsenic. And here we are. The photo behind the advertisement is the gallows at the Fayette County Jail. And I lied. These 2 are only photos here that are not held at KHS. This image is held at UK Special Collections. Fannie was born in Bourbon County in 1865, and by 1880, she was a live-in domestic in the home of a white Bourbon County family. She moved to Lexington in the 1880s, had a son named George, and lived in a section of town called Branch Alley. Now, if you're in Lexington or familiar with Lexington, Branch Alley used to be where today the main library is. There's an alleyway behind it where the parking garage for the county clerk and all those other shops on Main Street. There's an alleyway between that garage and the transit center. That was Branch Alley. And Branch Alley was a very interesting place. It was a small little alleyway. It was filled with brothels, gambling, prostitution, other forms of vice. But it was also home to Fannie and her son, George. It was prone to flooding, and papers described the area as, quote, a stream of living filth, because literally when it rained, when heavy rains hit the city and Lexington flooded, all of those flood waters and the sewage would literally flood into Branch Alley, hence the term a living stream of filth. Fannie amassed a lengthy rap sheet with Lexington police for robbery, larceny, insulting language, and vagrancy. But she also turned to the informal economy as a way to bust loose from the confinement of meager economic living. Working as a domestic laborer, of course, wages are not at all desirable or where they should be, even though Black women even though Black women found a multitude of ways to resist, but working and moving through the informal economy was definitely one of those ways. At some point between 1892 and 1895, Fannie and her family moved to Covington with her husband, known hustler James Bouncer White Harvey. This was not a good dude. Bouncer White had previous arrests and for assault, malicious cutting, maiming, even an attempted murder charge, and other violence toward men and women, including Fannie. In 1895, when Fannie had learned of Bouncer's infidelity, she set out to cut Bouncer with a straight razor, but he escaped through a second-story window. So it's literally raining Black people in Covington because he jumped out the window trying to get away from her. And of course, the police respond. And so Officer John Maurer arrived on the scene and physically manhandled Fannie. And in response, she pulled a razor out of her brassiere and she cut and detached his ear. She was sentenced to 5 years for malicious cutting and remanded to KSP, where she was reunited with Lyla White, who again had been previously admitted in 1892 to serve a 15-year sentence for manslaughter. I am always amazed by the fact that Fannie did not A, receive a death penalty, or that B, she was not shot on sight. But when you read newspaper accounts, had Officer Maurer assaulted her or shot her, newspaper accounts actually gave justification if he had chosen to do so. It's a stark read. Fannie and Lila shared experiences with family violence, and the decisions made in those confining spaces are what led them to the Kentucky prison. Domestic violence is a pattern of behaviors employed by an individual to maintain power and control over a partner or another in a domestic relationship. The term conjures thoughts of sexual or physical violence, but it can also include psychological and emotional abuse, which is what you definitely see in Lila's case, economic deprivation, which is what you see in Fannie's case, and physical and sexual threats and intimidation. These dynamics can be found in any relationship. In the 1970s, the women's rights movement drew attention to domestic violence as a threat to women and children, mobilizing grassroots organizations to establish the first, quote, battered women's shelter in 1974. And I say quote because I'm very particular about the language that I use. And instead of saying battered women or victims, I refer to folks as domestic violence survivors. And that's key. But we can come back to language. In 1974, in the 1980s, Congress recognized violence against women and children as a systemic issue and authorized the Family Violence Prevention Services Act, which created funding for domestic violence programs, prevention programs. But despite these 20th century efforts, America's history of family violence is much older than this and runs much deeper than people may realize. Even as early as 1640, the Puritans enacted laws to curb occurrences of domestic violence among spouses and between parents and children. Historian Elizabeth Pleck's examination of familial violence in early America argues that the lack of reporting of domestic violence was rooted in the family ideal, which refers to the beliefs in traditional rights of correction over dependents in the household, such as a wife, children, servants, enslaved folks, etc. But it also meant an ideal of family and marital unity, harmony, stability, and this ideal of family privacy. So what happens in the home stays in the home. And that's where those ideas are rooted. Because of this, patterns of abuse in the historical record are difficult to trace due to a lack of reporting and prosecution. And that's something that we continue to see in the 21st century. But newspaper accounts didn't consider Fannie and Lila's experiences with familial violence. In fact, they weren't considered to be victims of anything. Instead, they were criminalized, demonized, viewed as the she-devil, a modern-day Borgia, and colored Amazons, all terms used to vilify and criminalize Black women in the 19th century. And it's not so far off from many of the domestic violence cases that we hear in the 21st century. And most of these are taken from the Lexington Leader. So what do you do in these situations? Antebellum legal measures provided women with the ability to address and confront their abusers in court via divorce proceedings, and sometimes you had instances of public shaming for perpetrators, but those options weren't available to all women. Lila and Fannie stories introduce us to two additional forms of resistance, truancy and reciprocal violence. Although both women ultimately resorted to crime, each first negotiated her confinement in the home through truancy. Historian Stephanie Camp defined truancy as a temporary escape from the oppressive regimes that compelled, we're talking specifically about enslaved people, to work as drudges for most of their lives, and that intended to limit the time and meanings for independent activity. Truants would periodically run to nearby plantations, swamps, or wooded areas for brief periods of time, whether it be overnight or up to several weeks, only to return to the initial space of confinement. Gender ideals and family dynamics were also forms of confinement. Some women stuck with truancy rather than becoming permanent runaways, particularly because of the stigma placed on women who abandon their children and the importance of the familial duty in relationship to Black womanhood. Although Stephanie Camp's discussion of truancy is rooted in slavery in the antebellum South, it certainly applies to the Gilded Age in Kentucky. In both cases, Lila and Fannie remained silent to authorities about their abuse. Lila endured regular beatings from her father, and he authorized his wife, Eliza, to participate in said beatings, claiming that Lila had been difficult to manage. Eliza also participated in psychological abuse, whether known or unknown to Peter, by stealing Lila's clothes from her wardrobe. All the while, Lila remained quiet, probably out of fear or shame that it would bring to the family, or perhaps of even a greater punishment from her parents in retaliation to her reporting. It doesn't appear that she reported any of this abuse to her employer, Mrs. Frank Bissix. As I said before, as a result, Lila worked long hours and excuse me, in those long hours in the Bissix home, she learned to read, she learned to write, and she also sought comfort in an alternative, yet respectable social circles, because again, I said, she was literally beaten because she wanted to attend the church of her choice. So she did attempt to find other ways to stay outside of the home. Fannie, on the other hand, Fannie more than likely, her reports of abuse would more than likely have fell on deaf ears, if for no other reason than her reputation as a criminal. Law enforcement had responded to calls of violence between Fannie and Bouncer, which resulted in dual arrests. Fannie's engagement in Lexington's informal economy resulted in a significant number of arrests, but also may have served as her method of truancy. A temporary respite from her home and all of the issues happening with her husband, in addition to her involvement in the informal economy, may have served as an alternative means to provide for herself and for her son, George. So as you can see, Lila and Fannie engaged in various forms of truancy before engaging in reciprocal violence and were subsequently sentenced to the old Frankfort Penitentiary. Now, what you see here, if you're in Frankfort or if you live in Kentucky, then you know what you're looking at. This is the side of the baseball stadium that is at the state office building. Where the office building sits today is where the old Frankfort Penitentiary sat up until 1937, when it was destroyed by the Great Flood. Based on Sanborn maps, the area that you're looking at, I believe, would have been, if it wasn't the women's ward, it was adjacent to the women's ward. And then the other two images are taken from a 1912 lookbook that was published by the Commonwealth in order to boost public support of and confidence in the Frankfort Penitentiary. KSP was modeled after New York's Auburn Reformatory, excuse me, and opened in 1799. It housed incarcerated people in separate cells, enforced labor, and employed the use of the silent system, which prohibited communication amongst the incarcerated. The facility also served as the county jail early on. Between 1799 and 1825, 6 inspectors appointed by the Franklin County Court governed the prison, with daily oversight provided by a keeper. But in 1825, the Commonwealth shifted governance of the prison, and the General Assembly moved to the lessee system, which means that they began leasing the prison and the population within to an individual elected by the General Assembly. Lessees were appointed to 7-year terms and given full custody and management of the prison and its incarcerated population. So literally, Kentucky did not have control over its correctional facility and the folks therein. It literally leased it out. And so when we talk about convict leasing, a lot of historians, Southern historians in particular, talk about convict leasing, and we tend to think about this in terms of Reconstruction as a way to boost Southern economies, a way to control Black bodies after the Civil War. But Kentucky is unusual in that convict leasing is a practice that you find in the Commonwealth as early as 1825. And so Kentucky is literally, to some degree, serving as a model, if you will, for what comes down the line in the Deep South. Women were no strangers to the Kentucky Penitentiary. Annual reports reveal that imprisonment of Black women in antebellum Kentucky, between 1839 and 1840, the prison confined 3 Black women for unknown offenses. By 1868, over 50% of the prison population was comprised of Black men and women, and the institution housed a total of 35 women, all of whom were Black, with the exception of 1 white woman. Between 1845 and 1858, the women's cell house consisted of a 20-foot square building, 10 feet from the male cell house. Let's be clear, the Frankfort prison was a co-ed facility well into the 19th century. It remained a co-ed facility until it was destroyed by the flood of 1937. This is an anomaly. Indiana has the first women's prison in 1876. In New York, you have what we now call Bedford Hills Correctional Facility and other cottage models of prisons. Illinois had a women's prison in the late 19th century, but Kentucky made it all the way to the early 20th century, and a flood forced the Commonwealth to create an institution just for women. So prison administrators, after 1858, moved women to a large room above the infirmary until the state constructed a separate cell house in 1873. The new women's quarters consisted of a two-story building that contained 36 cells, a spinning wheel, an infirmary, a dining area, and a kitchen. And again, the building was situated between two male cell blocks without barriers until prison officials erected a wooden fence in 1896. And the only reason why the fence was constructed is because of consistent sexual interactions between the incarcerated men and women in the facility. So what happened to Fannie and Lila? We cannot have a wild Kentucky history story without the presence of William Goble. So in 1897, Lila and Fannie were central figures in a prison shocker that rocked the Kentucky political scene and rivaled the scandals that had previously plagued the Frankfort prison for fiscal mismanagement and the use of incarcerated labor. That year, then State Senator William Goble opened an investigation into Warden R.A. Hancock. And so that is the man that you see here on my left, about allegations of lumber fraud. Hancock was using an incarcerated man who had been convicted of fraud to serve as the institution's bookkeeper. And private lumber contractors were delivering lumber to the penitentiary because folks were making chairs, they were making brooms, a whole host of things that required lumber. Goble and fellow Senator C.J. Bronston, who is this gentleman that you see here on the right, placed Fannie Keyes Harvey on the stand. So there is a Black woman in 1897 who is testifying against the Republican prison administration in the Commonwealth. And this hearing took place in the old state capitol that's right next door to the Kentucky History Center. And Fannie's testimony exposed a litany of abuses against incarcerated people, including pregnancy, the second pregnancy of her friend, Lyla White, and other women housed in this co-ed institution. Fannie revealed details of the women's prison experience, incarcerated perspectives on treatment and prison management, and gave voice to working class persons whose perspectives would have otherwise gone unmentioned without her participation in this spectacle. What's interesting is that Bronston had prosecuted both Fannie and Lila while he was the Commonwealth's attorney in Fayette County. And William Goble was a private attorney just entering the state Senate when Fannie was arrested for cutting the police officer in Covington. So they knew who was being placed on the stand. They knew who she was. They knew who Lila was as well. But yet Fannie still testified at the request of the Senate, and she recounted memories of beatings that she and other incarcerated men and women had endured at KSP. So what happened to them? In 1901, Lila was granted parole and returned to her father's home. So she went right back to the original site of her confinement. Census records indicate that her stepmother had died prior to her release. And while the family retained its respectable reputation, it appears that her abuse continued. She continued also serving as a domestic worker in Lexington. Bruising to the head and when her father turned her over at the age of to the state at the age of 34. She died 2 years later of a grand mal seizure that would not stop as a result of neurosyphilis. So she died alone, still at Eastern State, and she is buried in one of the mass graves there at what is now the Technical and Community College. So she died in 1917. Miss Fannie also died in 1917. She was released from prison in 1899, but returned in 1902 for robbery. And then again in 1907 for a second conviction for malicious cutting after she cut a live-in paramour of hers. And although she received a life sentence in that case, she was paroled in 1913. She buried her son George in 1915, and she died alone and destitute in Frankfort as a washerwoman at the age of 54, and she is buried in Green Hill Cemetery in the Pauper's Field. It's also important for me to point out that Fannie, that life sentence that she received was given under the Habitual Criminal Act. And as far as I can tell, Fannie is the first Black woman and first woman broadly in US history to receive a life sentence under what we today would call a 3 strikes law. So I'm going to stop there just in case there are questions and open it up. Before I do, I'll share this with you. This is me with no hair at KHS in 2016. And the quilt that I am standing over and talking to, I'm sure I'm talking to Mandy Higgins about this quilt, was made by the incarcerated women at the Pewee Valley Correctional Institution for Women. It's a part of their domestic violence survivors group, and each quilt contains a drawing made by one of the women in the group that recounts a memory from her abusive situation. This quilt led to the pardoning or parole of, I believe, 13 women when it was made, and the governor at the time escapes me, but it will come to me, I'm sure, in the course of the questions. And then the photo to your right, the woman who is looking at you, I believe her to be Fannie Keys Harvey. This image is also in the KHS collection, and comparing the prisoner description books that are housed at KDLA with the description, with the image that you see here, I believe that is who that is. So, thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. Yes, I'm going to open it up for questions. Go ahead and put those in the chat so that we can get a discussion going here. I, as one who's involved in the, interpretation of the old state capitol, I am so glad you have told us this. Wow, thank you. Rebecca and I were kind of freaking out together, like, oh, we have to tell this story. This testifying, it took place in the Senate chamber, to your knowledge?
Yes. Yes.
Interesting. Thank you. I do have a.
To my knowledge, she did not testify before the House. This solely took place in the Senate.
Okay. So earlier on, we did have Diana commented that you mentioned Joseph Dinelli, and she mentioned having researched him while working on her cousin's ancestry. So she was interested to see him pop up again. Jody Lewis, who is our Learning Services Director, she says, I am interested to hear how and why Fannie was chosen to testify against the prison system. And I'm also interested to hear more about public shaming.
Yes, definitely. Hi, Jody. So when you read the Senate testimony, and I can send you that source. It's in the General Assembly, the giant books that they have, the Senate journals, it's in there. William Goebel actually asks some of the incarcerated men that he's called to testify, who else would be willing and not afraid to speak to the experiences of men and women in this institution, who will come to the stand and tell the truth. And there are the two people that he does ask, they say Fannie Keys Harvey. She'll tell you whatever you want to. And so it's her reputation for forthrightness and just no holds barred. That's what gets her on the stand. And I've always found it interesting that, again, they knew who she was. Most people in Kentucky at the time probably knew who she was since she cut a police officer. But Goebel and in particular, they had, Bronston had tried her on a number of occasions. And so they knew who she was, but that's what did it. She was literally recommended by fellow incarcerated men.
It's another wrinkle on Goebel too. Interesting that he's doing prison reform investigation.
Goebel is fascinating.
Say again?
Fascinating. Goebel is fascinating and on so many levels.
Yes. Diana, I wanted to know, she said, did anything positive come from the legislature's hearings, or was it business as usual?
So yes, in 1898, this hearings actually, it literally changed the way Kentucky managed its prisons. So it wasn't just business as usual. Now, the treatment of incarcerated people remained business as usual because there's a subsequent scandal about violence toward incarcerated men and women that happens in, I would say, 1900, 1901. Warden Chin was involved and he was forced to step down, or he stepped down in the middle of all of these accusations. So the treatment doesn't change, but what does happen is at the same time that Goebel is pushing his election bill, C.J. Bronston pushes a prison reform bill, and it's prison bill of 1898, and it removes the prison, both prisons at that time, because there's the Frankfort prison and then there's what we now call the Kentucky Penitentiary at Eddyville. Those are the two that exist at the time. It moves oversight from the Board of Sinking Fund Commissioners, and it creates an actual Board of Prison Commissioners. Now, was this new board effective? Did it do anything? That's a whole nother conversation, and I could probably come back on another day and talk about that. But what it does do is it changes oversight for Kentucky's correctional institutions.
Thank you. Jody asked if we could circle back. She had wanted to know about public shaming. She's curious about how that was conducted and how long it lasted.
So this takes place more so in the 17th century. You see it in Puritan communities, you see it in other colonial spaces. And basically what would happen if you had an individual who was labeled as a quote unquote wife beater, he may be paraded through town and shamed. He may also be subject to a public whipping, things of that sort. But it's one of those it's punishment by public humiliation. And I can send the book you should check out specifically that goes into really deep detail about those things is called Domestic Tyranny. And it's written by a historian named Elizabeth Pleck.
All right. Thank you. Did we have any other questions that anybody wanted to submit? Oh, Stephanie, I missed you. I'm sorry. Stephanie says, thinking about the events of 2020, what can these experiences tell us about gender and incarceration today?
Everything. And it can tell us that not much has changed since 1897. There are still scores of men and women who are surviving domestic violence, who are forced to make decisions about their independence, about their freedom, which could potentially either leave them in those confining spaces or could potentially take them to a state-sanctioned form of confinement, as you see with Lila and Fannie. But what's key is that Fannie and Lila were literally silenced. Unless you went and dug into the Lexington leader looking for them, you wouldn't know their stories. And it echoes things that happen in the 21st century when we talk about the lives of Black women and the struggles that Black women face, and how it is that oftentimes the voices and the stories of Black women either A, go unnoticed, or or often just outright ignored. It also says a lot about we as historians look at the longue durée, how things have changed over time. It tells you that things have not changed over time, because I'm quite sure, had I not framed this as something that took place in the 19th century and just told you the stories that Lila and Fannie had experienced, you probably would have not even considered, that this took place 120 some odd years ago, because this is something that you could read about in any newspaper right now. So we've had these strides. We have the congressional legislation to provide support for domestic violence initiatives. But at the same time, the Violence Against Women Act has gone unreauthorized, if that's a word. I'm going to make it up, because you have congressional leaders that do not really give weight to these same issues that plague our communities.
Thank you. Richard. This is Dr. Charlene J. Fletcher who's speaking.
Hi, Richard.
You've been late, missed your name. And says you did a great job. All right. Any other questions that anybody wanted to submit or comments? All right. Dr. Fletcher, thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm so excited about just learning these stories. So I'll have to hit you up for some of your sources. But thank you for joining us this month for First Friday. Do please plan to come back next month. We are going to be delving into the issue of Confederate memory again. Our speaker is Dr. Christopher C. Moore, and the book that he has published is called Apostle of the Lost Cause, J. William Jones, Baptists and the Development of Confederate Memory. So come on back. All right, guys, we'll see you next month.
Thank you.
Dr. Fletcher, oh my gosh, thank you so much.
Anytime.
We've had lots of discussions about the stories that we tell at the old state capitol and wanting to bring out, women, people of color, and it's not just focusing on the dead white guys. And so, and it's, like you said, it's not always really easy to find. So I appreciate your research very much.
Absolutely. I will share, I'll share that Senate testimony with you. I want to say this took place over 3 or 4 days. Fannie and there was one other woman who testified, a white woman. Her name was Ruth. and her last name just walked right out of my brain. But she opens, they open testimony with Ruth. She was a white woman from Eastern Kentucky that was, I want to say she was there for 4 years for housebreaking. And her testimony came like a day before she was actually paroled. Um, so I can definitely shoot over that transcript to you. It's
Thank
all in the Senate Journal.
That would be fantastic. Yes, those are huge books. Bless you for going through them.
Yeah, it's the 1897 Senate Journal.
Oh man. All right. Well, again, everybody
have it already. You probably have it. I'll just send you the page number. There you go.
All right.
All right.
I'm muted. Sorry about laughing in your all's ear.
We're getting several thank yous, and Jackie says we learned a lot. We'll get a copy of Domestic Tyranny and look at your work as well when it's published. So, all right, guys, thank you so much.
Before we let you go, Dr. Fletcher, one thing I don't know if Stuart's still on here, but since you were a fellow here, we might follow up with you. And I don't know if you saw the article that came out in the Washington Post where they're looking at American democracy and the lack of investment in civics and social studies education. And we've been doing this for a while, but I think it's going to kickstart some ideas about why are we not investing in these histories? And so to be able to maybe use your story, your work through the fellowship, and just being here today as a way to help encourage and advocate for the greater investment in civics and social studies education.
Absolutely. I would actually love that. My postdoc is coming to an end, and I am the new curator of African American life and history at Conner Prairie here in Indianapolis.
Oh,
so I am a new museum person. Look at that.
Well, if you need any dirt on Norman or Rich Cooper, you let me know. I have spent many a conference evenings with those two, and I've got you covered.
Well, I have enjoyed this is my third week. I have enjoyed it immensely. We're going to do some awesome things. Our director of exhibits is absolutely amazing. And so we're going to do magical things. And so we are also kind of touching those questions as well in terms of civics education and curriculum and things of that sort. And so I am tasked with creating an African American settlement at Conner Prairie, and then infusing Conner Prairie with African American history, not as this separate individual thing, but I mean, history is history. So you got to go with it. I don't make this up. Yeah. This is what happened, and so we need to talk about it. So I am always here for working with KHS. I mean, you guys already know that. So
yeah, no, that'd be great. Actually, knowing that you're at Conner Prairie too, Jody and Stuart and the whole team, I think there's some interesting relationship pieces through what the work that Conner Prairie does. And we were talking before this all started, one of my foundational experiences was as a 15-year-old being at Conner Prairie. I was like, I want to be a museum person after doing that. Quite honestly, I always thought I'd end up working up there, or at least in Indianapolis as a young Hoosier. But anyhow, where they're moving their work, I think is interesting, and understanding it. Somewhat conflicted with how they're making it this inquiry education element that they brought out in the Washington Post, which I think, again, their open doors policy and how they're reconciling the first person interpretation that they're based upon versus just how visitors want to interact. So I think you'll have a very interesting perspective on developing that kind of programming.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, Rich is, I don't know if you knew, Rich was down in at the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center for a long time. That's where he started off.
We talked quite a bit about it. And Rich is great. He is He's an innovative thinker and just open to, you know, let's get some change going and get, you know, awesome guest engagement happening. So I think we're going to do some pretty interesting, pretty fabulous things.
Well, that's awesome to hear. We'll make sure we follow up with you, and hopefully we can continue and continue working.
So please let me know. I still also have a foot in academia, working at affiliated with Africana Studies at IUPUI. So I'm in a lot of different worlds. So
Perfect.
Let me know. Keep me posted.
We appreciate you doing this again.
Thank you so much.
Have a great weekend.
You
Bye,
too.
guys.
Bye.